Hey, it's Mark and welcome back to Segue to Reason. Now, if there was any group of people who should have understood who Jesus was, his mission and his purpose, and his ultimate sufferings and death, then certainly it would be the 12 disciples. After all, they had spent 3 years as part of his inner circle, and it's not as though Jesus hadn't warned them before that he was going to be martyred. In fact, on one occasion, Peter rebuked Jesus and said, "Lord, that's never going to happen to you." Clearly, the disciples just didn't understand Jesus. Which begs the question, were they stupid? In 1748, John Newton, the Englishman who wrote the famous hymn Amazing Grace, underwent a spiritual conversion. He became an evangelical Christian. Now, during the 1700s, Britain's economy revolved around the African slave trade in which Newton himself was employed. Now, you would think that after having a spiritual conversion that maybe he might possibly choose a different career path, but he didn't. In fact, only 2 years later, he became the captain of a slave ship. And the only reason why he gave that up several years later was due to health concerns. Now, to give him credit, later on in his life, he did protest against slavery and along with other evangelicals, put an end to Britain's involvement in it. But it still begs the question, doesn't it? How could Newton, a devout evangelical Christian, have no qualms about slavery? In fact, he wasn't alone. He would actually have Bible studies on the deck of his ship with captains of other slave ships who shared his evangelical viewpoint. How could these people, how could these men study the life and teachings of Jesus Christ and yet be so completely disconnected with the very fact that just beneath their feet were men and women who were being held captive against their will? It makes no sense. And yet it boiled down to culture. Slavery was simply culturally acceptable back then, even in Africa, just as long as it wasn't your tribe that was being enslaved. And so the disciples in many ways really weren't that much different from Newton. They, along with every other Israelite, were eagerly awaiting the promised Messiah, who it was believed would overthrow the Romans from Israel. And their scriptures, which we refer to as the Old Testament, spoke of the coming of this great Messiah, in which there were certain passages that their scholars interpreted to mean that this Messiah would be this great warrior who would obviously overthrow the Romans. But all the other passages which clearly spoke instead of a suffering Messiah who would be despised and rejected, well, those passages were conveniently overlooked. So in many ways we can't really blame the disciples. They were, after all, just fishermen, not scholars. And they had grown up with this cultural narrative that this great warrior Messiah could appear at any moment. And it's very clear that even after the resurrection, the disciples still expected Jesus to, well, do something about the Romans. In spite of everything that Jesus had tried to teach them about himself, they couldn't help but project their own cultural expectations upon him. So I guess that what I'm trying to say in this video is that the disciples weren't stupid. They were just like you and I, products of their own culture and time. Keep searching.